So today we're going to talk about something that fundamentally shaped our world, the Atlantic slave trade. But we're not just going to look at it as a series of terrible events. We're going to break it down as what it really was, a highly organized global economic system, a system that connected 3 continents and really built the modern economy. All right, let's get into it.
To even begin to understand this, you have to start with the sheer scale of the human cost. We're talking about somewhere between 10 and 12 million African people forcibly taken from their homes and shipped to the Americas. And you have to understand this wasn't random. It was the largest forced migration in all of human history, and it was all designed to power a new global economy.
And that's the absolute key to understanding it. Yes, it was an unimaginable human tragedy, of course, but if you really want to get why it was so powerful, why it lasted for centuries, you have to see its design. It was a meticulously built economic machine, and it was engineered for one thing and one thing only: profit.
So, what was the fuel for this machine? What created the insane demand that drove the whole thing? Well, it all started with an economic idea called mercantilism, which was basically the playbook for all of Europe's colonial ambitions.
The logic was actually pretty simple. European countries set up colonies to get their hands on incredibly valuable raw materials, things like sugar, cotton, tobacco. Now, to make the most money possible, you've got to keep your costs way down. And since growing these crops was backbreaking, incredibly intensive work, the single biggest expense was always labor. The brutal answer to that problem? Find labor you don't have to pay.
Now, at first, the colonists tried other things. They used European indentured servants who'd work for, say, 4 to 7 years to pay off a debt. But you see, they were still legally people, and their service ended. That made for a really inconsistent workforce. Enslaved Africans, on the other hand, were forced into a system of permanent bondage. They were legally redefined as property, creating a constant and even hereditary source of labor. It was a cold, hard, brutal calculation, but from that purely economic view, they were the more profitable option.
And it's this demand that kicks off the first leg of that infamous triangular trade route. You had ships loaded up with all sorts of manufactured goods, leaving ports in Europe and heading straight for the coast of West Africa.
And make no mistake, this was a trade. It was a brutally calculated business transaction. Europeans would arrive with things like guns, metal pots, fancy cloth, and rum, and these goods were then exchanged, traded, with African merchants and local rulers for human beings.
It's a common misconception that Europeans just sailed to Africa and captured millions of people themselves. Now, that did happen sometimes, but it wasn't how the system primarily worked. The fact is, European powers weren't strong enough to just conquer the powerful African kingdoms of the time. So instead, they plugged themselves into existing local networks of trade and warfare, exchanging their goods for people who had already been captured by other Africans.
This brings us to a really difficult and complex question. Why would African kingdoms participate in this? The answer? Well, it boils down to intense economic and military pressure that created this devastating self-fueling cycle.
At first, the motivation was pretty straightforward: wealth and power. African kings could make their own kingdoms richer and get an edge over their rivals by trading. And it's really important to understand, they didn't see the people they sold as fellow Africans in the way we might think of it today. These were outsiders, criminals, people who owed debts, or most often, prisoners captured in wars against enemy groups.
And this quote just perfectly captures the vicious trap that was created. Once one kingdom got guns from Europeans, its neighbors desperately needed guns to defend themselves. And what was the one thing Europeans wanted in exchange for those guns? More enslaved people. So participating in the trade went from being an opportunity to being an absolute necessity for survival. It became a horrifying arms race, with human lives as the currency.
Once captured and traded, these people were forced onto ships to begin the second leg of the journey, the horrific Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean. This was, without a doubt, the deadliest part of the entire system.
The conditions are just almost impossible to imagine. People were packed below deck so tightly that each person had on average just 4 square feet of space. A witness who testified before the British Parliament put it this way: "They had not so much room as a man in his coffin. Disease, dehydration, starvation, and unbelievable brutality were everywhere. As many as 1 in 5 people, that's up to 20%, died during the voyage. Think about that. For every 5 people forced onto those ships, 1 never made it across. The human cargo was simply seen as a disposable part of the business model." For those who did survive that journey, they arrived in the Americas only to be forced into a new and uniquely dehumanizing system,
chattel slavery. And this wasn't just forced labor. It was a very specific legal framework designed to extract the maximum amount of work for the maximum amount of profit.
So, what is chattel slavery? Well, the word chattel is actually related to our modern word cattle. It means movable property. Under this system, a human being is legally stripped of their personhood and turned into an object, an item that can be bought, sold, or inherited, just like a farm animal. The sociologist Orlando Patterson famously called it a state of social death, where you are violently torn away from your family, your culture, your history, your name, everything.
And this wasn't just some abstract idea. It was deliberately, methodically written into law. You can see it happening in early court cases, like the John Punch case in 1640, where he, an African servant, was sentenced to servitude for life, while the white servants with him got much shorter sentences. Then came the real turning point in 1662, a Virginia law that said a child's status, free or enslaved, followed the status of the mother. And just like that, slavery became hereditary, ensuring a permanent self-reproducing workforce for generations.
The work itself was absolutely lethal. On the sugar plantations in places like Brazil, which were some of the most brutal, the average life expectancy for an enslaved person was just 23 years old. The work was so dangerous that overseers would often keep hatchets nearby, not as weapons, but for quick amputations when workers got their limbs caught in the powerful cane-crushing machinery.
So, all of this brutal labor, it produced the very raw materials that formed the third and final leg of the triangle, the leg that finally closed the economic loop.
Ships were loaded to the brim with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee, all the cash crops that Europe was absolutely craving. They sailed back to Europe, where these goods were processed and sold, generating massive fortunes for merchants, investors, and the governments of entire nations.
And right there, the circuit was complete. The profits made from selling those crops in Europe were then used to finance new voyages, to buy more guns and textiles, to trade in Africa for more people, starting the whole brutal cycle over and over again. It was a terrifyingly efficient, incredibly profitable, and completely self-sustaining economic engine.
So you see, the triangle trade wasn't just some dark chapter in a history book. It was a foundational piece of the modern global economy. It built empires, it helped fuel the Industrial Revolution, and it created staggering amounts of wealth that still exists today. And that leaves us with a really big question to think about. In a world that was so profoundly shaped by this system, what is the true inheritance of a world built by the gears of this brutal machine?